Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into what literally feels like a Hollywood movie, but it's actually the unbelievably true and honestly terrifyingly physical story of Japan's most impossible prison breaks. We're tracking the legend of Yoshie Shiratori. This guy, he just completely refused to be caged.
4. That is the exact number of inescapable, maximum security prisons that this one man completely defeated. And these weren't just your standard run-of-the-mill lockups. With every single escape, the Japanese authorities built stronger, heavier, and just incredibly brutal enclosures designed specifically to break him. But, as we're going to see, it really only forced him to level up his ingenuity.
So that brings us to the core question of this explainer. How exactly did one man break out of Japan's absolute highest security fortresses using literally nothing but soup, human excrement, and double-jointed shoulders? Well, to understand the how, we kind of have to look at the why. Back in 1933, Shiratori was convicted of a murder he swore he was framed for. Forced into a false confession, guards subjected him to brutal daily torture. And that intense, visceral trauma, that became the ultimate fuel for his lifelong defiance.
Okay, let's get into it. Level 1, Amori Prison in 1936, the decor.
This first breakout is almost like a classic magic trick, but it totally set the stage for his methodical nature. Shiratori spent months studying just a brief 15-minute gap in the guards' morning patrol. While bathing, he managed to find this thin metal wire wrapped around a bucket and sneaked it back to his cell. When that tiny 15-minute window opened, he picked his lock, stuffed his futon with loose floorboards so it looked like he was sleeping, and just vanished. Unfortunately, he was recaptured 3 days later while stealing medical supplies from a hospital, and his sentence was bumped up to life.
So that brings us to Level 2, Akita Prison, 1942, the copper cell.
Because Shiratori was obviously a massive flight risk now, authorities built a specialized, supposedly unbeatable cell. Just picture this for a second. Extremely high ceilings. Walls completely lined with smooth copper, meaning absolutely zero grip. He was forced to wear heavy handcuffs 24/7, and the only exit was this tiny, tiny skylight at the very top of the room. Mathematically and physically impossible to beat, right? Well, or so they thought.
To get out of this one, Shiratori used a genuinely horrifying hidden physical trick. He popped his own thumbs out of joint. Yeah, you heard that right. Every single night, he'd dislocate his thumbs just to slip out of the handcuffs, and then somehow scaled those completely smooth copper walls in total darkness. Over several months, he silently loosened the wooden frame around that tiny skylight, and then, when a violent thunderstorm finally rolled in and masked his noise, he just slipped right out into the night.
But man, freedom did not last long. About 3 months later, totally exhausted, Shiratori made a fateful decision. He went to ask for help from Kobayashi, the one guard at Akita who had actually shown him basic human kindness. He genuinely trusted this guy. But Kobayashi called the cops. This heartbreaking betrayal sent Shiratori right back into the system, and this time he was sent to his absolute ultimate nightmare.
Which is Level 3, Abashiri Prison, 1944, the masterpiece.
Abashiri was this legendary frozen wilderness fortress up in Hokkaido. Nobody had ever escaped it. So how did they lock him down? 44 pounds of specially manufactured iron shackles. No keyholes, you literally needed heavy industrial equipment to get these things off. Since they never took him off, maggots actually started breeding in his flesh. It's incredibly grim. On top of that, zero furniture, and they forced him to wear thin summer clothes during the freezing, sub-zero Hokkaido winter. They were actively trying to destroy him mentally and physically. But they made one huge mistake. They gave him a bowl of warm miso soup every day. In an act of just absolute genius and pure desperation, Shiratori didn't drink it all. Instead, he saved parts of it and repeatedly spit the soup right onto his iron shackles and the metal frame of his food slot. Miso soup is loaded with salt, right? So over months and months, that salt chemically corroded the solid iron. When a wartime blackout finally plunged the whole prison into darkness, he snapped the weakened cuffs, dislocated both of his shoulders, and squeezed his entire adult body through a food slot the size of a serving tray. I mean, he actually achieved the impossible. He became the first and only person to ever escape Abashiri. He fled into the mountains and survived for 2 years, living as a hermit in an abandoned mine shaft, literally surviving on nuts and berries until World War II ended. But tragically, while he was stealing food from a farm, he got into a self-defense altercation and the farmer died. Shiratori was captured again, slapped with a death sentence, and sent straight to his final boss level. Level 4, Sapporo Prison, 1947. The Misdirection.
Now, Sapporo Prison knew exactly who they were dealing with here. They threw 6 armed guards at him 24 hours a day and heavily reinforced the walls and the ceiling to stop his signature upward escapes. But Shiratori, he was a total master of psychology. He noticed the guards were obsessively staring at the ceiling and walls. So, what did he do? He just stared at the ceiling too. Every single day, he pretended to study it, completely playing into their overconfidence. The guards got so hyper-focused on the ceiling and honestly so arrogant about their setup that they actually stopped handcuffing him. And way more importantly, they completely ignored the floor.
Left without cuffs, he went right to work. He fashioned this tiny saw from a piece of his metal wash basin, used his miso soup bowls as shovels, and get this, to hide his tools, he hid them inside tubes filled with his own human excrement. He correctly guessed the guards would be way too disgusted to actually search his cell properly. On March 31, 1947, he sawed straight through the floorboards and dug a 2-meter tunnel right under their noses in just 2 hours. That's 4 prisons, 4 utterly impossible escapes.
Which brings us to 1948, defeated by a cigarette, the true escape.
After 4 of the most mind-blowing breakouts in true crime history, you are honestly not going to believe how this legendary fugitive was finally stopped. Shiratori lived under a fake name for a year, but man, he was just exhausted, physically and mentally broken from a literal lifetime of torture, running, and surviving in the wild. One day, he's just sitting on a park bench in Sapporo. A police officer wanders over and sits down next to him. The cop has absolutely zero clue who he is, doesn't recognize Japan's most wanted man at all, and the officer simply offers him a cigarette.
As one observer perfectly put it, this simple act of kindness, the first genuine human warmth Shiratori had experienced in years, broke something inside him. That one single cigarette managed to achieve what 44 pounds of iron, sub-zero winters, smooth copper walls, and armed guards never, ever could. Shiratori smoked the cigarette, calmly turned to the officer, told him exactly who he was, and just followed him to the station to surrender.
The High Court eventually reviewed his case, realized the farmer's death was actually self-defense, and they revoked his death sentence. He was transferred to Fuchu prison, and the contrast here is just staggering. Abashiri relied on brutal, freezing torture and heavy iron. Fuchu prison, they gave him basic human dignity, respect, and humane treatment. And because he was finally, genuinely treated like a human being, he never even tried to escape again. He spent 14 peaceful years there before finally being paroled.
Shiratori lived out the rest of his days as a free man, but his legacy completely cemented. He became an absolute folk hero in Japan. In fact, he was so deeply feared and respected by the penal system that there's this famous anecdote where prison guards would allegedly beg him, "Please escape when I'm not on duty." They knew for a fact that if he really wanted out, no wall on earth was going to hold him.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative question to chew on. Was Yoshie Shiratori a criminal mastermind who just played the system like a grandmaster? Or was he simply a desperately abused man who proved that treating prisoners humanely is the only true way to prevent an escape? Just think about the immense power of that one cigarette and the sheer weight of basic human dignity.